like to introduce the title of the talk and welcome Mohan. The title is Taste and Texture, Why Food is Our Superpower for Climate Action Success, and Why Changing Your Diet is the Best Way to Protect the Planet. We're going to explore why we need to swiftly adopt more plant-based diets in this session, and we'll learn how we can prioritize and accelerate critical and urgent climate action through scaling up healthy, joyous, ethical eating practices. So if you've been looking for one of those individual levers that when multiplied across many, many individuals could make a huge difference, something you actually could feel a little bit in control of, this is a great session for you. And I hope you all enjoy it very, very much. So Mohan Gurunathan is our guest. He's an engineer, entrepreneur, and activist who has lived and worked in Silicon Valley for over 20 years. Around 7 years ago, he became keenly interested in getting a better understanding of climate change, the environment, and food sustainability. And he has researched these topics in depth and shared his knowledge with the community via numerous public talks and published articles. Mohan acts as an advisor to several environmental and animal advocacy nonprofits, and I have seen him in action doing that. And he lives in Mountain View with his wife and 2 young daughters. So welcome, Mohan. Thank you for gracing our Turn Week with your presence and being a part of it a couple times in a row now.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, Kristen. Can everybody hear me? Can give me a thumbs up if you do. Great. Well, I'm honored to be here and honored to be speaker at Turn. Okay, I'm going to start the talk with something everyone should be pretty familiar with. We're headed into a pretty scary and uncertain future. We've already seen the impacts of climate change start to occur. You know about the increasing wildfires, the flooding, the extreme weather, and these are increasing year after year. We are also in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of wildlife in the planet's history, and it's clear that humans are to blame for this. None of this should be news to you, and I imagine that's part of the reason you're attending talks like this one. So the first thing is I want to thank you for caring enough to actually attend these kinds of talks and be interested in finding solutions. So when we're faced with such an overwhelming number of problems, it's not surprising that many people may feel defeated and hopeless about the situation. We've known these problems are coming for decades, but our leaders have failed to act. And, you know, a full half of our political spectrum doesn't even acknowledge that we have a crisis. So if our leaders won't act, what difference can any one person make? I think that many people are facing this or this kind of thinking, and I call it climate paralysis, thinking that nothing you do as an individual can make a difference because the problem is too large. The underlying message for the talk is it's not too late and we can still turn things around, but we have to act swiftly and we have to motivate behavior change on the level of millions of people. The other message is that, you know, individual actions do matter. This is not all in the hands of politicians and executives, that we really do have power as individuals to make things better. But how do we do it? So these are the things I hear about most often. Bike to work or school, use public transportation, buy an electric vehicle, stop flying, get solar panels, electrify your home, recycle and compost, and get politically active. So I think we had a good coverage of the answers in the chat here. And these are all great things. We need to absolutely do these things. Most of them are associated with reducing or eliminating fossil fuel consumption. And we absolutely have to phase out fossil fuels. That's a big part of the problem. But what else can you do? And I'm not going to quiz you because you've already answered this in the chat. It's been said that avoiding meat and dairy may be the single biggest way to reduce our impact on Earth. And this is not just me saying that. This is a quote from a leading environmental researcher, Dr. Joseph Poore from the University of Oxford, and it's backed up by multiple studies. And when I first, when I first learned about this about 10 years ago, this was a real surprise to me because all I was hearing on CNN and in the news is that fossil fuels are the problem. We have to stop fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are a big part of the problem, but nobody ever talked about diet. And when I came across this information 10 years ago, it perplexed me. I was wondering, how can that be the most impactful thing? When I see factories belching smoke into the air, I can directly connect that to climate change. But when I eat a hamburger or a hot dog, how does that actually connect to climate change and to other environmental issues? And I think a lot of people still don't really understand the connections between what happens when we eat animal products and how that affects the environment. So the main purpose of my talk is really to explore all of these connections between what happens when we eat animal products and how does that influence so many different aspects of what happens in the world. And it turns out to go much deeper than just climate change. So there are many other issues related, and we're going to talk about all of those. Okay, so the first point I want to make, just to give you a concept of the scale of something we take for granted, something rather obvious is that everyone has to eat. The current answer is 7.6 billion humans to feed. So if you assume each human needs 3 square meals a day, that's 23 billion meals that must be prepared and grown every day. If you think about it, it's just an enormous amount of food that we need to grow. Of all the things that humans produce, there's few things that we have to produce on this scale. And so it's really important that we produce food as sustainably as possible. Another point to think about is eventually we can phase out fossil fuels. Hopefully we are able to do that in a decade or two, but food, we'll never be able to phase out food. So again, the emphasis has to be on producing food as sustainably as possible if we want to feed everybody on Earth. Okay, so now we're going to go back to some basic biology lessons. So the sun is the source of all food energy on Earth. I'm just going to do a quick overview of the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is basically the process by which all organisms get their energy or their food. So it starts with the sun, and the sun provides solar energy to plants, which through photosynthesis, they combine that energy with carbon dioxide from the air and water from the ground to create energetic compounds called carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are eaten by animals. These animals combine that with oxygen from the air to release the energy, and in the process, they exhale carbon dioxide, which goes back into the air. And in theory, these are roughly balanced. The carbon dioxide that's exhaled by animals is roughly balanced by what's taken up by plants, and that should be more or less a closed cycle. There are also animals that don't eat the plants directly, but they eat other plants. They also exhale carbon dioxide, which goes back into that cycle. Now, I want to point out a couple things in this diagram. All the blue arrows are different factors that put carbon into the atmosphere. So there's the closed cycle exhalations of animals, but there are also other things that put carbon in the atmosphere. Significantly, there's fossil fuel burning. So fossil fuel burning is an unbalanced activity because we take carbon that's been locked underground for a long period of time and we burn it and we put that into the air, and there's nothing taking that out. So obviously that's going to increase the carbon concentration in the air. There's also certain processes that generate methane. And methane is a very powerful climate warming gas that is not counterbalanced. It's not taken out of the air by anything. So methane is a significant thing we should be concerned about. One thing I want to draw attention to is the 2 red arrows. The 2 red arrows indicate there's only 2 major forces that take carbon out of the air. The first is the oceans. The oceans play a major role in stabilizing the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. But we don't have a lot of control over that. The oceans absorb based on what the current concentration is. And we don't really want the oceans to absorb any more than they're already doing, because that creates something called ocean acidification, which impacts the ability of shellfish to create their shells, and it affects food systems in the ocean severely. The thing we do have control over somewhat is photosynthesis. So we need to consider that plants are really our best ally in terms of combating climate change, because plants are a natural technology that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and we need to preserve in particular, forests and trees are really our best weapon in combating climate change. And that's going to be relevant when we get a little bit later in the discussion. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that preserving trees and forests is extremely important. So what the 10% law says is that as you travel up this pyramid, only about 10% of the energy is passed from one stage to the next. So for instance, if you make 100 units of food energy at the bottom, only 10% of that is available to the primary consumers, and only 1% of that reaches the secondary consumers. And so basically it's saying 90% of the energy is lost when you go from one trophic level to the next. Where does all that energy go? Well, a lot of it's lost in just the business of living. So metabolism, digestion, bodily processes, moving around. Digestion is not a perfect process either, so there's efficiency loss. Some of it's passed out as waste. But on average, this is just a rule of thumb, about 10% is available to the next trophic level. So this is an important concept in ecosystems. So, and this will be relevant to the next slide. So as humans, we often like to think we're at the top of the food chain and that, we're an apex predator. But let me start with a hypothetical here. Imagine a hypothetical world where all humans are vegetarian, and we would have a trophic level diagram that looks like this. So we have our 7.6 billion humans at the top, and we're one level up from the crops that we grow. And we grow all these crops to feed humans directly. So this is what that trophic level diagram looks like. Now let's take the same population, so I keep the triangle size the same, and we put them at the second trophic level. And so this is more closer to our current reality, where we use animals, also called livestock, as a middleman. So we grow plants, we feed them to animals, and then we feed on the animals or their products. And so what did this do to the entire diagram? What you can see is that because of the 10% law, we need roughly 10 times more land, 10 times more water, 10 times more fertilizer, and we also create 10 times more manure and billions of more mouths that we need to feed. So you can just see how exponentially the problem grows when we start to use animals as a technology for processing food. And it's all because of the concept of the 10% law. Now, the 10% law is just a rough rule of thumb. I'll give you some rough real world efficiencies. These are called feed conversion efficiencies in the industry. So the idea is how much you put in versus how much you get out. And if you look in terms of protein, for beef products, you put in 25 units of plant protein to get back 1 unit of meat protein. So that's a 96% loss of the protein, and the calorie loss is similar. For pig protein, you put in 10 units of plant protein, you get 1 unit of pork protein out. So it's a 90% loss of the protein and calories. And for chickens, you put in roughly 4.5 units and you get 1 unit of protein out. So 78% loss. So many times people say chickens are, relatively efficient livestock. I would say, you're still losing 78% of what you're putting in. So I don't consider any of these particularly efficient. So we touched on this a little bit, but where does all of that excess energy, that 96% you lose in the case of cattle, much of it goes into breathing, growing, thinking, pumping blood, just the business of living. But energy loss is also in waste gases that you get out. So there's the carbon dioxide. Cattle and other animals that eat grass, so cattle, sheep, and goats, they have a special digestion process that exhales methane. So pigs and chickens don't exhale methane. It's specific to animals that eat grass. So energy goes into some of these waste gases. Energy passes through the animal and is in manure, and it comes out in waste gases from manure. These are highly potent greenhouse gases. So N2O is nitrous oxide, methane is CH4, and these are 86 times and 296 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of their heat trapping potential. And another reason there's a huge inefficiency is that roughly when you slaughter an animal, about 50% of the carcass is inedible. So that's hooves and horns, skin, and all the parts that people don't eat. So you have to feed the animal a lot of crops to grow all of those parts, and then we end up throwing them out or using them as byproducts. So that's another major reason for inefficiency. So I want to give another example, which I think is pretty striking when you look at dairy production. So let's take a look at what do you put into a dairy cow and what do you get out from the dairy cow on a daily basis. So a typical dairy cow, when it's lactating, will eat about 55 pounds of dry feed per day. And this will be a combination of hay or silage and edible crops like corn and soybeans. And it'll drink about 300 pounds of fresh water per day, which is 36 gallons of water. So then what do you get out for that input? So you get out about 70 pounds of milk from that cow and about 120 pounds of feces and urine. So the first thing to notice is you actually get more feces and urine from dairy farming than you do milk. And in some dairy farms I've seen, the ratio is even worse than this. It can be 3-to-1 for manure versus milk ratio. I really think they should call it manure farming, not dairy farming. So dairy farms create an enormous amount of this waste, and disposing of it is a major challenge. But let's put the waste aside for a second and just look at how much food went in and how much went out. So you have 55 pounds going in and 70 pounds of milk going out. So at first, that doesn't seem too bad, right? But then you have to realize milk is 87% water. So really, for that 55 pounds you put in, all you did is create 9 pounds of milk proteins and fats. And you have to recognize how much water it took to grow all of this. This took over 8,000 gallons of water to grow all of this feed. So if you think about it, we spent 8,000 gallons of water to produce 8 gallons of mostly water and all of this manure. So it's just a staggering waste of resources, and we really don't get much back for what we put in. The same principle applies to pretty much all animal product production. So here's a study from 2017 that shows the land use impact of different foods. So if you look through all these, you can see there's a clear separation between all of the plant-based products, which are at the bottom, and all of the animal-based products, which are at the top. Barley is a strange outlier. I don't know exactly why barley is so land intensive, but if we ignore that, you can see clearly that the plant-based products are significantly less land intensive than the animal-based products. Let's compare, for instance, soybeans to grow, and this is for growing the same amount of protein. So 100 grams of protein for each of these cases. So if you compare soybeans to beef, for instance, a soybean to grow 100 grams of soybean protein, you need about a meter squared. And beef will range anywhere from 100 to 150 meters squared. So you're talking 100 times the impact in terms of land use for growing the same amount of protein. And a similar analysis was done in 2018 about the greenhouse gas emissions of different foods. And again, when you look at the plant-based products, they're significantly less than any animal-based product, with beef, of course, being the worst offender. Okay, so we've seen that animal products require a lot of land and they produce a large amount of greenhouse gases. Let's take a look at who is consuming the most animal products around the world. So in this map, you see by far the bulk of animal product consumption is in wealthy Western countries. So the US and Australia are at the top of the list with about 198 pounds per person per year. South America is also very animal heavy. And Europe, Israel, Canada, and Russia are also quite high. So if we agree that we need to reduce global meat consumption, I feel the biggest burden needs to be on the countries that are consuming the most, which includes us, the United States. What's really concerning is that developing regions of the world, particularly China, India, and some African countries, they're starting to copy the consumption patterns of the West. And while meat production is somewhat peaking in Western countries, it's rapidly growing in developing countries. And that is a major issue that we need to urgently work on stemming that rise in the developing world. Okay, so given the large amount of animal product consumption we have in the U.S., this is what it means in terms of land usage in the U.S. The outlined area here is all land that's used to either graze animals or to grow feed for animals. And that's about 41% of the U.S. land mass. So around half of it is for grazing and around half is for growing feed crops. And it's just a vast percentage of our total country's land. Much of the land here used to be natural ecosystems like forests, marshes, grasslands, wetlands, but we've transformed it all into agricultural lands. So pastures that should be forests, and vast monocrop fields of corn and soy that should be wetlands. So in the process, we've driven out dozens of wild species like deer, elk, buffalo, birds, and more. And that's all just to support our livestock. Also compared the area called food we eat. So this relatively small area compared to the livestock, this is where all our vegetables, our fruits, our nuts, our grains, they're all grown in this relatively small area. If we look at a global scale, the trend is the same. So this map is, in concept, it's similar to the previous one where all the land used for one particular purpose is grouped together and colored a certain color. So if you look at the red region here, you can see the land we use globally to raise livestock is about 27% of all habitable land on Earth. It takes up the equivalent area of North and South America combined. This even exceeds the land we have of remaining forests. So remaining forests are 26%. So we're using more land for livestock than we have for forests right now. Now compare it to the purple area here. This is cropland for crops directly consumed by humans. So the fruits, the vegetables, et cetera. That's only 7% of global cropland. So quite a bit less. But what's really striking is if you look at how many calories we get from each. So that small percentage of land, the purple area, produces 82% of the calories that humans consume. And the enormous red area produces only 18% of the calories that humans consume. So really, globally, we are mostly powered by plants. As much as we think of ourselves as omnivores and meat eaters, we are primarily powered by plants. Humanity is. And a relatively small percentage of our calories and protein come from an enormous use of land. So you can see it's really not a good use of land, and certainly not sustainable. So I believe what we have is a livestock crisis on our planet. We have a planet that has more farm animals than humans. I want to give you some numbers around this. So the most recent data that I found was 77 billion land animals per year. Most of these are actually chickens. So this is obviously around 10 animals killed for each man, woman, and child on the planet per year. It's just an enormous, unimaginable, it's hard to fathom 77 billion animals being killed. And remember, for every animal that's killed, another one has to be born to take its place. So we have a constant supply of meat and livestock products. So there's a significant part of humanity's, if you say, work on this planet is breeding and killing animals, which is kind of frightening. I don't want to forget about marine animals because the numbers are even larger here. So the answer is we don't really know how many individuals that we kill because fish catch is counted by the ton. It's not counted by the individuals. And there are other issues. A lot of fishing is illegal and unrecorded, so we don't have a count of those. And a lot of fish catch, what they do is they actually throw out a significant percentage of what they catch. They throw it back dead into the ocean, and we don't have a count of that. So the best estimates we have are between 1 to 2 trillion. So just, again, unimaginable amount of killing, and it's hard for anybody to wrap their head around these kinds of numbers, I think. Here's the scary thing. There are predictions that our livestock consumption worldwide is going to double by 2050. And we don't have enough land or sea to allow this to happen. We would need a whole nother earth to support this kind of livestock growth. So this is largely being driven by rising incomes in the developing world and the developing world copying the consumption patterns of the West. So it's a major problem we have to tackle as a society, but it's definitely something that we should be aware of. So given so many animals on Earth, what this has done is it's squeezed all of the wild animals into almost oblivion. If you look at all the mammals on Earth, 96% of the mammals consist of humans and our livestock. Only 4% of mammals on Earth are still wild. So that includes all of the bears, wolves, elephants, giraffes, lions, monkeys, all other mammals you can think of are squeezed into that 4%. And this is largely because we take the land from the wild animals and we use it for our livestock. And we're on the verge of wiping out nature entirely because of our livestock. And there's not much room for the system to increase without disastrous consequences. Okay, so I think you've got a pretty good picture by now why livestock production is really problematic. But there are many different individual issues caused by our addiction to livestock products. There's so many issues that, in fact, animal agriculture has been called the most destructive industry on Earth. So I want to dive a bit deeper and explain a few of these issues that are caused by livestock farming. So the issues we're going to talk about are these ones. We've touched on some of them already, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about them as we go on. Okay, so we looked at greenhouse gas emissions of livestock, but it may not be clear, how do livestock actually cause climate change? So I want to give you there's basically 5 different ways that livestock cause climate change. So we know that livestock exhale CO2, but that's mostly balanced by the CO2 absorption of the plants that they eat. But a major problem is that we are constantly deforesting the planet to grow more food for animals. And when we deforest, we slash a rainforest and we burn it and it goes up in smoke, and that's carbon that goes in the atmosphere. So deforestation is happening around the clock all over the world for livestock production, and that's a major driver of climate change. A second one is the methane that we talked about. So certain animals like cows, sheep, and goats, they exhale methane as part of their digestive process. When we have 1.3 billion cows on Earth, it all adds up. And that methane has a strong effect on heat trapping. So that's the second reason that causes climate change. The third is you also get methane and nitrous oxide from manure. And as we saw with the dairy cows, the livestock create enormous amounts of manure. So that's the third reason. The fourth is fertilizer also emits greenhouse gases, and a large amount of the fertilizer we use is for livestock feed crops. And the fifth reason is just the process of raising an animal and transporting it to slaughter and refrigerating the end product. And just the slaughter process in general is very energy intensive. So that also uses a lot of fossil fuel based energies. And we already talked about how these two gases, methane and nitrous oxide, are very potent. So if we put this in the context of other areas that are causing climate change, how does it compare? Well, animal ag is often compared to transportation. So if you take the emissions of every plane, car, truck, train, bus, and other form of transportation on Earth, and you total those up, animal agriculture is considered to be responsible for at least that much, which is about 14.5% of global greenhouse emissions. However, there's good reason to think that this is an underestimate. And one reason why it's probably an underestimate is they're not considering something called rewilding potential. So what is rewilding potential? What that means is, remember all of this red land that's currently occupied by livestock or by feed crops. So a lot of this land used to be natural wild ecosystems like forests and marshes and et cetera. If somehow we managed to shift humanity to be mostly to a plant-based diet, we could allow forests to regenerate on all of this land. And that forest regeneration would suck up a huge amount of carbon from the atmosphere. This effect is not considered in the 14.5% calculation. This natural forest regrowth could reverse or soak up to 19 years of global fossil fuels emissions. And if you consider that in the calculation, the 14.5% rises to at least 28%. So this clearly makes the livestock one of the top three causes of global warming. What is clear from several studies is that unless we significantly reduce our livestock consumption, we cannot keep climate change under 2 degrees. So this is a must. We have to do this if we want to at least slow or stop climate change. So let's talk about some of the other problems. We've already touched on this. Deforestation. So this is what deforestation looks like. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of deforestation. So sometimes you hear about palm oil and you hear about other causes. There are certainly other causes of deforestation, but expansion for livestock is the leading cause by far, and it's primarily cattle ranching. So nowhere is this more evident than the Amazon rainforest. Back in 2019, you probably read all the headlines about the fires in the Amazon, but they rarely talk about what's causing these fires. Did you ever wonder how do you have a fire in a rainforest? It's wet there, right? How does anything catch fire? So these fires are all intentionally set by humans. You can't light the vegetation on fire when it's wet. So what they do is they use chainsaws and machetes to cut down the trees and all the vegetation, and they haul all of the lumber, the heavy logs out of there, and then they wait a week or two until all the vegetation is dry, and then they throw in a match and they burn it. And the reason is because they're clearing land. This land will, within a year or two, they can plant soybeans here or they can grow it as pasture. And this is continuously happening in the Amazon rainforest with the support of the Brazilian government. So it's a major, major issue. Incidentally, we do buy Brazilian beef in the US. So if you do buy beef here, you may be buying beef that's causing deforestation. So the Amazon is not the only place we are clearing rainforest on Earth. Worldwide, we're losing, every second we lose about 1 to 2 acres of rainforest. And the leading driver of this is livestock production. So have you ever taken a drive out in the country and you see a scene like this? I frequently take my kids on drives and we see, these animals out in the pasture, and everybody's, thinks it's a beautiful pastoral scene with the pasture. And the problem is that we see this all over the country, but grazing animals are not a natural part of ecosystems. They're introduced species by humans. And in many cases, they're not adapted to the landscape and they do tremendous damage. So a major issue is called overgrazing. So you can see here what happens if you leave animals on pasture too long. They'll eat everything in sight and they'll cover the ground with their droppings. And this is happening, unfortunately, all over the country and all over the world, overgrazing, and it's ruining native ecosystems. So I'll read a quote from the Center for Biological Diversity. The ecological costs of livestock grazing exceed that of any other Western land use. In the arid West, livestock grazing is the most widespread cause of species endangerment. By destroying vegetation, damaging wildlife habitats, and disrupting natural processes, livestock grazing wreaks ecological havoc, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly, Center for Biological Diversity and other organizations recognize this as a major problem, but it's not something you hear often about. And when you see cows in a field, it doesn't jump to mind that this is problematic, but it is a major issue. Okay, so it should come as no surprise when we tear down rainforests and we introduce cows into wild ecosystems. We end up killing or displacing many of the wild species that live there. So every day we lose about 150 species on Earth. And the primary cause, again, is habitat loss and rainforest destruction. And we already looked at that statistic that only 4% of the wild animals are remaining. Okay, so what are some ways that you're encouraged to reduce water usage? So the meat and dairy industry use 1/3 of the Earth's fresh water. In the US, it's even greater. They use 55% of the US's fresh water. So compare that to 5% for domestic water use. Now, domestic means all your showers, all your washing clothes, washing dishes, watering your lawn. All of that takes only 5% of the US's water supply, whereas 55% goes to raising animals. And most of that is growing feed crops. So really, it's kind of a joke to say, take a shorter shower when we should be talking about what you eat. To give you some concrete examples, to produce a hamburger, it takes about 1 month of shower water. And to produce a gallon of milk, it takes about 2 months of shower water. So shorter showers are not the answer to water conservation. Okay, here's the next issue. So these are some rather unpleasant pictures. The top one is a manure lagoon from a pig factory farm. The bottom is an aerial view of a cattle feedlot. So farm animals produce an insane amount of waste. In the US, farm animals produce 130 times as much feces and urine as the human population. And that's not a typo, it's really 130 times. So as a country, we are literally swimming in animal waste, but you almost never hear about this issue. Not only are these lagoons, these are called liquefied manure lagoons, not only are they full of toxic animal waste, but they're full of antibiotic residues. So it's a perfect cocktail to breed antibiotic resistant bacteria. And here's the really gross part. There's almost no laws to regulate how this waste is stored or disposed. So typically they're kept in giant open air pits. And when these pits fill up or overflow, they'll be drained and they'll be pumped underground, or they'll be spread onto farm fields, or unbelievably, they actually aerosolize this and they mist it into the air, calling it a form of fertilizer. So ultimately, much of this ends up in our streams, our rivers, or our groundwater. And so whenever you hear in the news about like a massive fish die-off or E. coli contamination of food, it's very likely to be caused by manure disposal from one of these farms. So another issue that's closely related to that is called ocean dead zones. So all of this waste eventually runs off into rivers and streams, and those all eventually make their way to the ocean. So if you look along the coastline of countries around the world, you'll find areas where there's not enough oxygen for fish to live. And the main reason is that when you have nutrient-rich water, algae can bloom out of control and they consume all of the oxygen in the water. And then fish can no longer live in those areas. So these are called hypoxic zones. And you can see they're all in coastal regions, typically where rivers exit the land into the ocean. Here's a zoom into the Gulf of Mexico. This is one of the largest hypoxic zones in the world. And you can see there are areas, the red areas, there's zero oxygen left in the water. And these are all near, the Mississippi River where it exits into the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because the Mississippi River passes through the heartland, which is full of animal factory farms. And all of that makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so antibiotic overuse is another serious problem. In the US, 80% of the antibiotics that are sold are not given to humans, they're given to livestock. So why do livestock need antibiotics? Well, in the crowded and filthy conditions we raise animals, they often need antibiotics to keep from getting sick. But what's more concerning is the following, that antibiotics are used as continuous low dosage growth promoters. When you dose animals with continuous low levels of antibiotics, the bacteria can mutate and evolve and get used to that. Basically, you kill off the weak pathogens and the strong ones survive. So you create superbugs. And this is a leading reason that our medications are becoming less effective. And so this is definitely a serious problem for not only for the animals, but for humans as well. This is closely related to the next issue, pandemic risk. So a quote from Dr. Michael Greger, who's an infectious disease specialist. He says, if you actually want to create global pandemics, then build factory farms. And the reason is because these are basically petri dishes. They're like a perfect petri dish for incubating a new disease. And if you look through history over the last 100 years, you could see most of the pandemics that we've had are related to animals, and many of them to farm animals. So, COVID is thought to have come from a wet market, and we hear a lot about wet markets, but really the factory farm is probably a bigger ticking time bomb than a wet market, just because of the number of animals and the number of factory farms that we have. Okay, another issue is world hunger here. So worldwide, we grow enough food to feed 12 billion people, but because we feed so much of it to animals, we have 1 billion humans that live in constant hunger. Animal agriculture is part of the problem. There are also political and logistical challenges in food distribution, but animal agriculture is definitely a contributor to this problem. So I want to briefly talk about fishing, because this is sometimes omitted in discussions about animal farming. By far, the largest number of animals we kill come from the sea. Humans treat the sea as it's infinite and inexhaustible. But the reality is we are taking fish out faster than they can replenish themselves. So at this point, we've depleted over 90% of global fish stocks in the ocean. And the way we fish is a major problem, because we fish using these techniques that are indiscriminate in what they catch. So for instance, we use enormous mile-long nets to catch everything that we can. And many things they're not target species. So they're things we didn't intend to catch. And these are called bycatch. And they're sorted by hand and thrown back into the ocean. On average, about 40% of what we catch from the ocean is tossed back dead into the ocean. Some methods, though, are far worse than others. So one method called bottom trawling is used to catch shrimp and prawns that are typically animals that live at the bottom on the ocean floor. And the way we catch them is we drag a very heavy net. We rake it across the ocean floor, and it basically levels everything in its path. And for this, we basically square miles of ocean floor get completely leveled by these trawling nets. And the level of bycatch can be astounding. You can see here's a net showing the bycatch. We caught a sea turtle, they caught all kinds of fish that are not shrimp and prawns, which are the target species here. They can end up discarding up to 95% of what's here and just keep the shrimp and prawns. So it's a very wasteful industry. So a solution for the dwindling fish in the ocean that humanity has caused is people are moving now to fish farming. So if you buy fish in the US, there's about a 50% chance that your fish came from a farm. But fish farms have a unique set of problems of their own. So a question for the chat, what do you think they feed these fish? So I see other fish, anchovies, other fish and livestock. Good. So that's the right answer. So in many cases, they feed them ocean fish. So they grind up fish caught in the ocean to create fish protein, fish meal, and fish oil, and they feed those to farmed fish. And so it can take up to 5 pounds of ocean fish to make 1 pound of farm fish. Again, this is a trophic level thing that we talked about. So obviously this is not sustainable, and this is contributing to the decline of the oceans. And there are many other problems. We're not going to go into these, but disease, parasites, etc. All the other problems that you have when you intensively farm animals are seen in fish farms as well. Okay, what about sustainable meat and dairy? So if you've been to the supermarket, you might notice animal products are now coming with a lot of labels like organic and pasture raised, grass fed. So do these really mean things are better? So let's look at a couple of these. So first, let's look at organic. What does organic mean? Organic means a few things. First, the animal feed is GMO free and it's grown without pesticides or chemicals. Second, animals are not fed antibiotics or animal byproducts, these are good things. Third, animals must have some outdoor access, though a big loophole is this is entirely at the producer's discretion. So they could have very little outdoor access. And this is a negative, is that organic doesn't outlaw any of the common abuses that you see at other farms. So things like cutting off beaks, castrating animals without painkillers, all of that is still allowed under the organic label. From a climate point of view, studies show that organic meat is really not any better than conventional meat in terms of the climate cost. And if you think about it, the reason is that you still need the same inputs to raise that animal. Going organic doesn't change the resources that you need to raise the animal, the water, the land, the feed, all of that. If anything, because you're not using fertilizers and pesticides, those resources may be greater. So in some cases, organic meat has a heavier penalty on the climate than conventional meat. So if you see organic, you don't think that it's any better for the climate. Okay, well, how about grass-fed? So grass-fed is usually applied to beef. So we'll talk about it in a beef context. In the US, most cattle are raised on a grain-fed system. It's also called a feedlot. Grass-fed comprises a very small percentage. Well, the principles that apply here are that grass-fed cattle put on weight much more slowly because they're eating a lower energy feed. And so they can take up to 6 months longer to reach market weight. And all during that time, they're emitting methane. The second point is digesting grass causes more methane than digesting grain. So really, from a climate point of view, even though this looks better from a marketing point of view, grass-fed cattle generate 43% more methane than grain-fed, and they require a lot more land and water. So from a climate environmental point of view, it's not a win to go to grass-fed beef, though a lot of the marketing suggests that it is. Okay, lastly, I want to comment on this new movement called regeneratively grazed meat. Has anybody heard of this? Or has anybody seen this film called Kiss the Ground? It's a documentary on Netflix. So I see some yeses, some nos. Okay, so this is a growing movement, particularly in the beef industry. It goes under a couple different names, and it goes under holistic management, mob grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. These all are basically the same concept. And the idea is pioneered by this man, Alan Savory. He's a rancher and a so-called ecologist. And his claim is that we need grazing cows to reverse climate change. So he's basically taken, what we've seen, that cows are, a major problem, and he's turned the argument upside down. So his theory is that it's not the grazing that's the problem, it's the way we're doing the grazing. So if we follow his formula and we use more cows and we eat more beef, we can actually save the climate. And I only have one comment. I could do a whole presentation on this, but I want to leave you with one comment. My comment is don't buy it. This is junk science. There's a lot of studies that have shown that it's not sound, and it's been debunked. I encourage you to do your own research. There are a lot of good things discussed in Kiss the Ground, but this Kiss the Ground film does promote this idea of regenerative grazing, which from my research is completely false. So, of course, do your own research, please. Okay, so the next section is a short section. I don't think any discussion about animal agriculture is complete unless we consider the impact our food choices have on the lives of animals who are trapped in the food system. So this section will have some images that are a little difficult to watch, but I do hope you choose to stay. I do think this is an important aspect of the overall discussion, and I hope you agree and choose to stay for this. Okay, so this is what, the meat and dairy industry would like us to believe about their products, that all the animals are treated like we treat our cats and dogs, given plenty of space and, room to roam and rolling green hills, blue skies. We even see often the somewhat ridiculous cartoon of a pig happy to cook itself on the grill. So I'm sure you've seen that before. So this is, and I do think this psychologically makes us feel better about eating animals. And we think, we actually think this is the reality, and the marketing is very effective, and it convinces us that there's really no problem with eating animals. But if you look at the reality, the way we raise animals is to treat them like commodities, like units of production, like flesh-making machines, basically. The sole goal of a farmer is to raise as many animals from birth to slaughter as quickly as possible with the lowest cost of inputs. So frequently this means the animals are confined in a small space so they don't waste any calories moving around, and it makes them easier to handle. This is the dominant way of raising animals in the US. 99% of our livestock farms look like this, and the model is called concentrated animal feeding operation. It's also called factory farm. So to give you an idea of the mindset of the farming industry, here's a quote from National Hog Farmer magazine. The breeding sow should be thought of and treated as a valuable piece of machinery whose function is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. So this is the mentality of the entire livestock farming industry, with a few exceptions, but the majority of it, they treat animals according to this principle. Here's a picture of a modern chicken farm. Chicken are the most consumed land animal, with over 9 billion killed in the US every year. Perhaps the greatest crime we've levied against chickens is to mess up their genetics. So through generations of scientific breeding, we've created a new breed of chicken that grows enormously obese in a very short period of time. And that's so they can get to slaughter faster. But these chickens, they suffer terrible pain because of this rapid growth. And if allowed to live past 6 weeks, many of them would just die from heart failure because their hearts cannot keep up with their rapid growth. So we've created these Frankenstein livestock, and it's all for our own convenience. So pigs are some of the most intelligent animals on Earth. Their intelligence, they've been compared to 3-year-old human children, and they're also some of the most docile, friendly animals we know. But on factory farms, this is how they're treated. They're kept in metal stalls so small that they can't turn around. They spend their entire lives in here until they're slaughtered. And many of them develop severe psychological stress. Many of them basically go insane from these conditions because they're such intelligent animals. Now, I'm not going to go into all the different things that happen on these farms, but suffice to say, what most of us would think are unspeakable animal abuses are routine industry practice. All of these things happen with no anesthesia. The meat industry has managed to get a blanket legal exemption for animal cruelty in many of these cases. But if you or I were to do any one of these things to a single cat or dog, we could be prosecuted for felony animal cruelty. But this happens millions of times a day on factory farms, and it's completely legal because it's standard industry practice. I want to talk about 2 industries in particular because when I first started down this path, this was a shock to me. For many years, after I stopped eating meat, I still consumed dairy because I thought they don't have to kill a cow to take milk, right? Well, it turns out I didn't have all the information. Dairy cows produce milk for the same reason as all other mammals, and it's to feed their young. So what dairy farming involves is artificially inseminating the cows. And when the calf is born after 9 months, they have a 9-month pregnancy just like humans. The calf never gets to drink even a little bit of its mother's milk. It's separated from its mother the day it's born. And that's because they want to collect that milk and sell it to humans. So most of the calves are kept in temporary housing, separate from their mothers. They'll never see their mothers again. If you visit a dairy farm, you'll see visibly the mother cows are distressed. They are looking for their calf. They're bellowing in distress. And so the whole industry is based on taking babies from their mothers and sending many of these babies as infants to slaughter. And I never had a clue about this for the first 30 years of my life. And most people don't, because the industry, this is sort of the dirty secret of the dairy industry. Once I learned about it, I decided, I did not want to be a part of this anymore. So that's what led me to give up dairy products. I'll show you another shock I got is learning about the egg industry. So this is called the sexing operation. The production of eggs requires a constant production of new hens because hens, after 2 years, or 1 to 2 years, hens are retired, which means they're no longer producing enough eggs, so they're sent to slaughter. So there's a constant pipeline of new chickens being born who will grow up and lay eggs. And every day in the US, about 1.5 million new chicks are born who will grow up to be egg layers. Now, of course, they can't control whether these are born as male or female. And the males will never lay eggs, so they're not commercially profitable. So the job of a chick sexer is to identify the males and throw them into this chute, and the males are disposed of. The common ways are by grinding them, so they're dropped into a grinding machine, or they could be gassed, or they could be thrown in a dumpster, or they could be crushed. So again, this was a huge shock when I first learned it. I'm sharing it because I think still it's not widely known that this happens, but every day in the US this is happening. This is happening all over the world, in fact. And this is a fact that led me to give up eggs. Okay, so again, let's go back to labeling. What about these products that are labeled as humane? What does that mean? So I'll let you decide, but this is what a typical cage-free egg farm might look like. It's certainly not what I pictured when I think of cage-free. The crowding is still excessive, and cage-free doesn't mean that they're necessarily given any outdoor time, and it doesn't mean that any of the abuses like cutting off beaks or cutting off claws, it doesn't mean that any of those are not practiced. Those are still allowed in many cases. So the improvements in animal treatment are very minor, and ultimately all these animals will be killed. So In my analysis, none of this is really humane, no matter what sticker you put on it. But of course, that's a decision for everybody to make on their own. So finally, we can't forget there's a serious human social justice issue that we should consider. In the US, there are about 500,000 slaughterhouse workers, and these jobs are some of the most violent, dirty, dangerous, and psychologically damaging jobs. The industry in the US averages 2 amputations per week because the assembly lines are moving so fast. And who takes these jobs? Well, it turns out people who have no options. It's the most poor and disadvantaged people in our society. So immigrants, undocumented workers, disproportionately Black and brown laborers. And these are for minimum wage and long hours and abusive work conditions. But, most importantly, these jobs are psychologically traumatizing. I mean, can you imagine your job is for 9 hours a day to stick a knife into the throat of a struggling pig? And there are literally jobs like that. So what happens is people who work in these jobs become psychologically numb to violence, and they suffer high rates of PTSD, domestic abuse, violent crime is very high in these communities. COVID-19 is also, these are hotspots for COVID-19, but mental health issues are severe in slaughterhouse communities. And it's not a job I would wish upon anybody. So personally, I would love to see a day when we have a world without slaughterhouses. Okay, the hard part of the presentation is over. The rest of this should be comparatively easier. We're going to talk about the good news. So what's the good news from all of this? The good news is we have a very simple solution to many problems, both environmental problems and ethical problems and health problems. We haven't talked about health much, but this eating plant-based will significantly improve global health. The good news is we don't need to rely on politicians or executives to make these changes. We don't have to invent an exotic technology. We don't have to spend a huge amount of money. We already make this choice 3 times a day. So if we can mobilize many people to make this change towards plant-based diets, we can solve some of the world's biggest problems with a simple tool. More good news is that we know eating plant-based is good for you. I mean, study after study is coming out showing how we're killing ourselves with meat consumption. The medical establishment is finally recognizing all of the benefits of moving towards plant-based diets. Kaiser Permanente are now recommending plant-based diets to all of their patients. And we know they reduce risk of heart disease, also diabetes, obesity, and certain forms of cancer. The idea that you need animal protein to be fit and strong has been completely busted. There are so many athletes, and these are just a few of them, who have 100% plant-based, and they're smashing world records. So, the outdated idea that we all grew up with, that you need to eat your meat to build muscle, is completely false, and it's been proven over and over. Another outdated idea is that you need dairy products to get your calcium. You absolutely do not. You can get all the calcium you need from plant-based products, which is where cows get their calcium from in the first place. More good news is you're probably eating a lot of plant-based food already. So it's not that different in many ways from things that you already love, like peanut butter sandwiches and pasta with marinara sauce. It may mean leaving the ground beef out of the marinara sauce. So minor tweaks may be all that's required. And for things that are not vegan that you love, there's so many creative ways to make things vegan now, and there are great meat substitutes. So it's really not a life of deprivation, like people will sometimes, characterize going vegan as, oh, you're depriving yourself of so many things. It's absolutely not that way anymore. There's so many different ways to make food delicious. So what can you do? It's very simple. Just eat plant-based every day as much as you can. Some of you may have been pondering this and may be ready to go vegan or vegetarian overnight. If you can, do it. But if you can't, start with small steps. So here's an idea. Make a schedule where 2 days a week you don't have any animal products. or make your own schedule. Make it 1 day, 3 days. Just take a step in that direction. You can replace, this is a simple thing. There are so many delicious alternatives to cow's milk now. Stop buying cow's milk and replace it with a plant-based milk. And this is very doable today. Plant-based meat and cheese alternatives have taken off, and they're really delicious. So all it requires is you to give them a chance. So there may be some you like, some you don't like, but go out and try all the ones out there. I guarantee you'll find some that you like. If you feel up to it, this has motivated some people to completely change their diet, like a 21-day vegan challenge. And there's a number of them online that you can sign up for. So that's another way to motivate you. There's also email series, 10 Weeks to Vegan from Vegan Outreach is a great series you can sign up for. This is very important. So we need more than just you to change. We need a movement of people to change. And the only way that happens is through education, and culture change happens through community. So tell your friends about this, tell your family, tell your partner. So we need to, everything you learned here, if you learned something hopefully from this presentation, share it with others, because it's very important that people know. And I'm confident when people know this, they'll make the change. And finally, as an activist, if you're active against climate change, remember it's not just about fossil fuels. We have to continue talking about animal agriculture, and that's often missing from the conversation. So make sure to remind people that this is a major issue, and this affects so many different things going on in our world. And if they're talking about fossil fuels, they're missing a big piece of the picture. So finally, I'll just leave you with this quote. Albert Einstein's one of my heroes. And towards the end of his life, he became vegetarian because he predicted a lot of the predicaments we'd be in today. And his quote is, "Nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances of survival of life as much as the evolution to vegetarian diet." So I will leave you with that. And thank you for staying with me through the presentation. I appreciate it.